Those are Froot Loops.
Froot Loops.
My favorite. I've been a believer since I made Close Encounters 50 years ago. I wouldn't call that science fiction, I called it science speculation. Whenever Harrison was on a horse, it made me wistful for wanting to direct a full Western, a real Western.
We're interrupting our coverage.
How will disclosure change us? I believe for the better.
Thank you so much for doing this. I was always a fan of Richard Schickel, including his interviews with you.
So was I.
And I know from those interviews how you often viewed, I think, The Color Purple as a kind of turning point for you, where you began making films about, quote unquote, more serious or darker material. Yes. And so I wonder if this movie is, in some ways, I tend to see it as a return to some of the subject and material that drove you as a younger filmmaker, maybe some of the wonderment, but made by the filmmaker who's made all those movies since. How would you describe it?
Well, it's hard for me to describe it in those terms. It's easier for me to describe it as, my first film that will be, considered science fiction that I do not consider to be science fiction. It's much more reflective of the world as it is evolving and discoveries that are being made as we speak.
Well, just to take aliens out of it for a second, I was
Okay.
moved by how much your film is about empathy.
Yes.
And seeing directly into someone's eyes.
Yes.
You open the movie with American flags, little American flags. I'm curious if there's something about American life today that drove you to tell a story about empathy.
Well, I think every movie should have have great emphasis on empathy, because empathy sometimes feels like it's in short supply. We all have it. Sometimes we can't use it. Sometimes it's not allowed to be used if you want to stay aligned with your friends and your belief systems. But I think empathy is there for all of us. I certainly think we all have it for our children. We all have it for our friends. We just sometimes don't have it for each other. And so I thought that Disclosure Day could be a way to talk about that.
Was it 2023? All those videos came out of different possible encounters with
Yes.
UFOs, Navy
Yeah.
videos. How did you respond when you first saw those reports?
It was really 2017 when the New York Times came out with the story where they basically, a whistleblower had given them the FLIR footage of the Tic Tacs, and that were moving anti-ballistically through the air against 120 mile an hour headwinds and doing things that were impossible for any conventional aircraft to fly. And that's where for me, all the reports and all the UFO flaps in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, and the 80s, from Roswell in 1947 to the alleged abduction of Betty and Barney Hill in the 1950s, and to the Pascagoula incident, and to then the aerial school in Zimbabwe that John Mack from Yale did extensive interviews and research about, and all the documentaries that have been made, and suddenly Congress is talking about it, and senators are asking questions, and there are the subcommittees are being convened, and in 2023, it was the House Intelligence Committee had hearings where they interviewed Grush, Fravor, and Graves, who were basically blowing the whistle on things they knew that they thought it was time to speak under oath to both Congress and the American people. And that really turned everything on its head.
So there was no epiphany for you necessarily, I believe. It was maybe an ongoing kind of revelation.
Yeah, look, I've been a believer since I made Close Encounters 50 years ago. I wouldn't call that science fiction, I called it science speculation. And when I did press on Close Encounters, I refused to call it science fiction. But I was certainly a believer of life elsewhere, but I would always say, until I see a UAP or a UFO with my own eyes, I'm not going to categorically state that there's proof that there's life. Life from out there has come here. But I have changed that because I'm now willing to change my mind because of the circumstantial evidence, which is overwhelming.
There's a great deal in this movie about faith, and
Yes,
and
a lot of it, because that's what it would shake up.
And my impression is that your faith in filmmaking is as strong as ever, despite the concerns people have. What gives you, despite industry changes, despite AI, despite all the things that make people fear the doom and gloom in the movie industry, what gives you the faith in the movies?
The audience gives me the faith in the movies. The audience that after COVID started to trickle back into movie theaters, and even though the numbers are still not pre-COVID level numbers for any films that are being released now, it's robust more than it has been in many years. And the audience gives me belief that people still want to congregate in a dark space, and in the company of strangers to share an experience of a film that is made by storytellers, and that gives me faith to continue making films. I'm not against streaming. I'm not against movies made for streamers. I support that, and I've made movies for streamers. I haven't directed one yet, but I support that. But I am of the firm belief, which is why we released Hamnet in movie theaters and not on a streaming platform, because I believe there was an audience for Hamnet that needed to share that grieving together in a form of communion. And I thought it would be a more healthy experience to see Hamnet in a movie theater than on a streaming platform.
I think people will say the same about Disclosure Day. From the moment the hail turns to the cereal falling into the bowl,
Yeah.
I feel like it's just it's a grammar that is only yours.
I love that you caught that. That's great. Thank you.
Well, of course. I mean, it's maybe the first moment we know it is you making this movie.
Those are Froot Loops.
Froot Loops.
My favorite.
I have spoken to Marty Scorsese before about around when he was turning 80, he started to think, how many more do I have?
Yeah.
I'm guessing that's not your mentality.
I never think about how many more I have. It's just, I'm just hopeful that I will be, inspired when something comes along, as I was with Disclosure Day, and as I was with Fabelmans, and as I was with West Side Story before that. I'm just hoping that a subject comes along, and I always have something in development, but a subject comes along that grips me as tightly as Disclosure Day did, so I can go on and make another movie.
I think there could be something about a character who is just compelled almost out of body towards some action. In this, Emily Blunt in this movie, but Richard Dreyfuss in Close Encounters. I wonder if that's a type of character that you maybe identify with. If filmmaking is something almost like it is for them, for you.
Well, I identify with characters who aren't afraid of mysterious things happening to them, and who are fighting for their survival by trying to discover what they don't know. And Emily Blunt's character and Josh O'Connor's character, Margaret Fairchild and Daniel Kellner, are having things happening to them in real time that they can't explain. And they are desperate to find out what's the matter. And that sort of fuels a lot of the story.
I spoke to David
Kep?
around when you had just finished production on this, and he was sort of buzzing from the experience. He had never seen, he said that for a guy who's always extremely engaged, you were engaged in a way on this that he had never seen you before. Did you feel that way?
Yeah, I would never let David sleep on this thing. He got more notes from me on his phone than I've ever sent to anyone in my life. And because David loves the process, he loves the fact that we don't sculpt, and then we don't sculpt in steel. We sculpt in warm, wet clay, and it's always moving and changing and evolving. And because David is so hungry to continue to discover what is not, sacrosanct, and because of that, he's just a perfect partner for me to write with.
It's a wonderful collaboration you two have, and I think that what you're describing of that kind of curiosity is obviously in you and in this movie. It's a bold way that you ended, I would say. It's really enthralling, I think. I feel like you are hoping to start a conversation with this movie.
I am. I'm hoping to have people have a conversation, to think about it a lot, even perhaps see it again. I'm not to talk about commercial reasons for seeing it again, because there are so many questions people are going to have coming out of Disclosure Day, and by seeing it again, they are going to get some of those questions asked, but not all of them, answered, but not all of them. And I just want to start conversations about this, the subject.
I'll be seeing it again with my daughters. For
How old are your daughters?
10 and 13.
Oh, that's a good age.
Old enough.
That's a good age, yeah.
They love you, by the way.
Thank you.
But I would say there's also real admiration for what a whistleblower is in this film.
Yeah, yes.
Tell me about that. What interests you about? Whistleblowers have been foundational to many of the biggest news stories of the past 10 years.
Yes.
What draws you to a character who is, essentially a whistleblower?
Well, because a whistleblower is risking everything. They're risking their careers, they're risking gainful employment, they're risking their reputations, and there's some of them risking their lives.
I think I've heard you talk about a Western being what you want to...
Well, I would like to do a Western, and I'm working on one right now. I don't have any, I can't talk too much about it, but it's a genre that I've always loved. And I always feel that parts of the Raiders adventure movies are like Westerns. Whenever Harrison was on a horse, it made me wistful for wanting to direct a full Western, a real Western. Whenever Harrison was riding a horse.
I think it's probably surprising that you haven't, in a way.
Yeah, me too.
I think of every time I take a photograph, I think of your John Ford's story about the horizon.
That's a true story.
Yeah, it's in The Fabelmans.
He said that to me word for word. That is word for word my first and last meeting with John Ford.
I don't think about every frame I take. I remember that story. I'll end by just asking, I imagine The Fabelmans was just an extraordinary capstone. I was there in Toronto when you premiered it, when your sisters stood up.
Yes.
A movie unlike any you had made. The transition from, I imagine after that, it's a hard question, what do I do next?
Yeah, it was. It was the hardest question I ever had to ask myself, because there was such completion in resolving so many personal issues that I've never aired in public before The Fabelmans. And I didn't care whether people thought The Fabelmans was just a tale, a yarn, or whether they cared that it was actually all true. I didn't care about that. It was something I did for myself. I always used to say it was $40 million of therapy that I didn't have to pay for. Universal did. But it was something that I needed to make when I made it. I couldn't have made it a year before, and I couldn't have made it a year after. It was something that had to happen. It wouldn't have happened without Tony Kushner, who prodded me during West Side Story to tell that story and wouldn't leave me alone until I sat with him and wrote it.
Mm-hmm. And this came along, and you knew.
After a little bit of a break. Yeah.
And cut, we got it. Okay.